What's up, Wizards? It's Dev from Mtg. We like it of Magic, and I got an exciting one today. A very, very preliminary Theros Beyond Death standard tier list for you. Let's get hype, everybody, but let's actually sober it down a little bit because I want to say preliminary again because we don't really have too many results to base this tier list off of. I just wanted to go ahead and highlight what decks are very good and what decks are performing well this early in the format, and we'll revisit this tier list a little bit later on when Standard has developed more. But so far, we do have just enough results to pull together a list to figure out what decks are working and what decks aren't in this format. So the results that I think are most important start with the 5-0 league results from MTGO. That's probably the least important kind of data that we're getting this early, but it does mean something. Aside from that, we've had multiple events on MTGO, including the Standard Premier and the Standard Challenge. A little bit of a step up from the 5-0 list, but more importantly and most importantly, we've had SCG Richmond, the Classic from last week, that has really informed a lot of what Standard might look like in the next few weeks. So I'm weighting those results most heavily, but there are some other results to worry about here, and I'll talk about them as we go on. Another quick footnote here before I start the list. I will assume that if you're here interested in this content, it also means that you're interested in high-level Standard play, and as a product of that, you mostly know what cards and decks I'm talking about at any given point. Aside from that, just a quick reminder to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet for more content, and if you're feeling especially generous, throw $1 into the Patreon pot, link in the description for that, or just patreon.com/spmtg. $1 a month is all I ask. That'll let you vote on what decks and content we even do around here in the first place. But I've wasted enough of your time. Let's go ahead and get into the list, starting with the D tier. Now, there are two decks in the D tier, and as much as I talked about results at the beginning of the video, these two decks actually haven't produced too many results so far in the Standard environment, and that's why they're all the way down here in D tier, but I do want to highlight them, and they're on the list for very different reasons. The first one is Solez Enchantress, which I think might actually be the single best budget deck in the entire format. This is the deck that gets card advantage off of Cetessan Champion and Season of Growth, and usually tries to win off of a Paradise Druid they've stuck a Sentinel's Eyes to so it never loses its hexproof. This deck draws an awful lot of cards, has a pretty deep late game, and can sometimes recover even after sweepers really, really well, but at the same time, it hasn't produced too many results. It's a very difficult deck to pilot, and we're not quite sure what the final build actually is, which is true of most decks in this list, but at the same time, there's a lot of ways to build Solez Enchantress, and no one's hit upon the correct build yet to 5-0 this deck even. It hasn't produced really any results, but as far as watching the format and seeing what works, especially on a budget level, I think Solez Enchantress has a very special place in the format. We'll almost probably never see it top 8, but at the same time, it's here, and I wanted to point it out. But another deck that's in D tier is Adventures. We'll just say Adventures, whether it's Gruul Adventures or more likely Golgari, the green-black version of the deck. The only reason that I put this deck on this list is because even though it hasn't produced any results, much like Solez Enchantress, it has produced a lot of results in the past. This deck is top 8'd before in previous Standard environments, and Edgewall Innkeeper is still very much a good card. Same with Lovestruck Beast and Murderous Rider and a lot of the other cards in the Golgari Adventures deck. I put it here in D tier because, again, it hasn't produced much results or any results to speak of this season, but it's still a deck that you have to keep your eye on because just like Enchantress, it produces an awful lot of card advantage and has some really important and sticky threats once the mid-game hits. So I would keep my eye on Adventures. Also, the Selesnya version of the Adventures deck is something to remember exists, if nothing else, but going forward here, I'm not sure that the Adventures deck isn't just DOA, but remember that it exists because it has done a lot of good work in the past. Now, moving on to C tier, we have 4 decks in this tier. Actually, both of our next tiers, C and B, have 4 decks in them. We're going to start off here with Gruul and Simic Flash. I want to talk about both of these decks at the same time. There's a reason that these two decks are in C tier and the Adventures decks were in D tier. That's because the Adventures decks, just like Simic Flash and Gruul, were very popular and powerful in the last Standard environment, but haven't produced too many results so far. But unlike the Adventures decks, both Simic Flash and Gruul have won Mythic Championships. So you definitely got to keep them in your mind. I think Simic Flash is still a very powerful deck. Some people, just like in the last format, some people moved on from it, and then at a Mythic Championship, Brad Nelson and company, a lot of different people, popularized this Simic Flash deck. And I don't think that it's necessarily gone anywhere. It's still a powerful deck, and I do think it can still produce results. But so far in this season, a lot of people have moved on from the Simic Flash deck. But I don't think that means it's gone for good. The same thing's true of the Gruul deck, which won a Mythic Championship, but was never actually that popular outside of that Mythic Championship. You'd see some players on it sometimes in major events, but Gruul never got the respect it deserved, and it still isn't to this day. That's because if you're looking for an Embercleave deck, there are definitely at least two better decks for playing Embercleave in this format, but those decks don't get to play cards like Gruul Spellbreaker and Questing Beast, and sometimes even Lovestruck Beast, Pelt Collector. There are a lot of very good cards in the Gruul aggro deck. I'm worried that it's outshined by other aggro decks, but I'll also say that in a format full of aggro decks, a Gruul mid-range aggro deck is much better than the majority of small ball aggro decks. So we could see Gruul rise to a little bit more prominence, but I'm not sure that it's actually an important deck in this format. That said, it has produced a lot of amazing results before, and it hasn't lost any cards, to say the least. So I still think that Gruul is a very real deck in this format, despite the fact that it hasn't produced too many results outside of one Gruul list that 5-0'd in the league results. But there were a couple of other decks that received a lot of hype at the beginning of this format that haven't necessarily panned out, but I still think they belong in C tier, and that's Esper Hero and the Doom Foretold deck. And sometimes these are one and the same, but very often the Doom Foretold deck is an Esper deck, or it's a little bit more slow, controlly, and methodical. And then there's also the Doom Foretold deck that just plays Orzhov, and it plays Ephemia the Cacophony. That list is actually 5-0'd this season on MTGO, but only once, and I actually, despite what I say about league results, I actually don't weight them very heavily whatsoever. So I don't think that one 5-0 league result on MTGO really means too much for the Black-White Doom Foretold Ephemia deck, but at the same time, it was so heavily hyped going into the season because it got some new pieces, most notably Treacherous Blessing, but that wasn't the only one. There were definitely some other pieces like Birth of Melodus and Omen of the Sea that the Esper deck got, and I think Doom Foretold could still be a good player in this format, but just like the last season where people thought Esper Dance with Doom Foretold was going to be a very popular deck, and it even posted early results, but it kind of fell by the wayside. I think Doom Foretold will tell a very similar story in this format. Now, Esper Hero, on the other hand, I do think has the ability, just like Doom Foretold. I don't want to say that Doom Foretold is a bad deck, but Esper Hero has the ability to climb into the top ranks. It's definitely better than its placement on the tier list looks right now, but when you're looking at results, Esper Hero hasn't done enough so far compared to some of the other decks in the format. But obviously it's got Dream Trawler and a bunch of other amazing cards, Ashiok up on the top end of the curve now, and it got a bunch of things that it needed to thrive in this meta. I do think that Esper Hero is a good deck, but I'm not sure that it can stand up against the onslaught of much faster aggro decks and controlling decks that tend to shut its plan down with sweepers. But moving on to B tier here, like I said, we have 4 decks in this tier: Mono Black Devotion, Mono White Aggro, Fires of Invention, and Rakdos Knights. Now, Rakdos Knights has produced some real results, and it's one of the first decks on this list that I can actually talk about results for. This not only got one 5-0 finish in the league results, but it also got a top 16 at SCG Richmond, so it's a deck you want to pay attention to. I think it's a much better Embercleave deck than the Gruul deck. The addition of Rotting Regisaur instead of green cards like Questing Beast is actually amazing in this deck. Plus it gets Stormfist Crusader, very important card for the deck as well, and sometimes Spawn of Mayhem. There are a lot of very good cards for Rakdos Knights, and sometimes it's not so much a Knights deck as it is just a red-black Embercleave deck playing Rotting Regisaur. So I think that if you're going to play an Embercleave deck, this is a step above the Gruul deck, although still a step behind the other Embercleave deck in the format. Maybe multiple steps for what that's worth. But Rakdos Knights is still a good deck that gets to play a lot of good cards, obviously. As far as Fires of Invention, this has done some things in this format. It got first in the standard premiere, so it's definitely worth looking at, but it's also placed in other events in the top 16. So you definitely have to look at Jeskai Fires. It's still a real deck in this format, more so than decks of yesterday, like Simic Flash, Gruul, and Adventures and whatnot. At least this one has produced real results in this format up to now, and I think that means it's definitely worth looking at, especially considering it just got Dream Trawler and a couple of other cards that it really, really likes having access to. So I think that Fires is not dead in any way, shape, or form. Now, Mono White Aggro, it actually surprises me to put all the way up here in B tier, ahead of a couple of other decks in the B tier, but again, it has produced results. 3 top 8s in the Standard Challenge, and 6 lists in the total top 16 of the Standard Challenge is definitely something you cannot ignore, and it also did get a top 16 at SCG Richmond, just like Rakdos Knights. This is a snowball-y kind of deck that, as long as especially it gets to go first, when on the play it operates crazily, but as long as it gets to go first, it can snowball very quickly with a 1-drop into Daxos, into Heliod, into Linden, and then suddenly your entire team is huge. It's just a deck that, if left unchecked, if allowed to actually do the things it's trying to do, just gets out of hand really, really quickly, and it's pretty good against some of the top decks in this format right now. You know, it's got a great game against Mono Red, again, especially if it goes first. If it's on the draw against Mono Red, it's not a guaranteed win, especially in Game 1 for the Mono White deck, but it does have a lot of game against the Mono Red deck, and I think that also makes me want to put it in a little bit higher tier than you might expect it to be in. So it's here in B tier. I'm not sure what the future of the Mono White deck is in this format, but so far it's produced enough results that you definitely have to give it a tip of the hat. But up next is Mono Black Devotion to round out the B tier. Technically the best deck in the B tier is what I'm calling this, but I'm not actually sure that's entirely true. I don't think there's too much separation between all the decks in the B tier, but Mono Black Devotion has been around in this format, which is great because we weren't sure it was a real deck, but it turns out it's not too bad at all. It's got a top 16 at SCG Richmond, and it's got multiple top 16 in MTGO events, including a top 8 in one of those MTGO events. So it is, it turns out, a very real deck, and it has 5-0'd an awful lot for what that's worth in the league results on MTGO this season as well. So pretty established build of this deck so far from what I can tell. A lot of the builds that have produced results are very similar to one another, and it's obviously kind of a no-brainer to build the deck in the first place. There's not a whole lot of, you know, wiggle room in it in the eventual list that you arrive at. So it makes a lot of sense. This is a deck Wizards obviously pushed a little bit. Gary is an amazing card, but so is Ayara. Even things like Yarick's Finlurker and Nightmare Shepherd, which has found its way into the deck now, are just incredible cards, and it got multiple tools aside from Gary in the new set. So kind of to no one's surprise, Mono Black Devotion is a real deck, but it's not necessarily one of the realest decks in the format. I think they've done a really good job balancing it, but it still comes up at the top of the B tier, and I think it's an important and dangerous deck. But moving on to A tier, the really, really powerful stuff is in these next 2 tiers. In A tier, I'm going to start with Rakdos Sack, but Temur Reclamation is also in here. Now, Rakdos Sack is really on the cusp between A tier and B tier. I honestly think it's like a B plus or A minus tier deck right now. And you can't really argue with the results. I'll say that much, because this deck not only got second in the Standard Challenge on MTGO, but it also put something like 7 lists in either the top 16 of the Challenge or the Premier. I think it may have been the Premier, but it really dominated the results of the top 16 of one of these MTGO events, and that, again, you can't really argue with those kind of results. This is a very powerful deck that got a couple of new toys in the Akroan War, which it sometimes plays 1, occasionally 2 copies of, but it also got Woe Strider, which really put the deck over the top. So I think this is maybe the best cat combo deck in the format right now. You know, it gets Mayhem Devil and Woe Strider as its 3 drops, and it's just kind of unbelievable what that deck can actually do now, even in the Mono Red Aggro matchup, which is actually a really favored matchup considering that you have not only Mayhem Devil to ping your opponent's little guys, but you've got Priest of Forgotten Gods. And sometimes that can be just absolutely nasty. You know, sacrifice a couple of creatures, ping, ping. They sacrifice their bigger guy to Priest of Forgotten Gods when all the activations are over. It's just such a brutal deck when it's allowed to get going. And even though it's really, really difficult to pilot, it presents a lot of opportunities to win the game when you're playing it. I mean, there's just so many broken things it can do if it gets set up. And even if it can't get set up, it's got multiple creatures that can escape out of the graveyard or other ways to recover from sweepers. It's got Midnight Reapers. So it's really got a lot of dimensions to it and a lot of different ways it can play against different decks, and that's definitely the hallmark of a good list. So I really like Rakdos Sack, and even though I'm a little conflicted on my sort of decision to put it in A tier here, because I think it's a step or 2 behind a deck like Temur Reclamation, I still think the results so far denote a deck that deserves to be in A tier and could definitely have a future going forward, especially, again, if Mono Red is still a deck moving forward, and I think that it will be. Cards like Claim the Firstborn and Mayhem Devil are just so incredibly good against Mono Red that Rakdos Sack could have an easy place in this format from here on out. But as far as Temur Reclamation, this is, again, a deck with a lot of good results. It's got a top 8 finish at SCG Richmond, which instantly puts it in the top tiers, but it's also got multiple top 8s in MTGO events, whether you're talking about the Challenge or the Premier. It is also 5-0'd on multiple occasions in league results. This appears to be Temur Reclamation's time finally and actually. Just like last season, it appears as though Temur Reclamation is on the cusp, and it could either be one of the best decks in the format, or it could be a flash in the pan, a sort of mirage that we're all being convinced by in the early days of the format. This happened in the last format, in Throne of Eldraine Standard. Temur Reclamation was a deck that got a little bit of buzz at the beginning of the format, carried through some of that buzz all the way through to the end of that standard, but never really rose to real prominence. And I'm hoping that's not the story this time around. It certainly doesn't look like it. Again, a top 8 finish at SCG Richmond are very real results, but it's also been very consistent so far in this format, and that's something we haven't really seen from Reclamation in the past. So I think that it definitely deserves an A slot in this format, at least with its performance so far. A card like Storm's Wrath, the new 4-mana red Wrath that deals 4 damage to all the creatures and the planeswalkers, that has really helped put this deck over the top and given it a lot of game it didn't previously have against the faster decks in the format, creating some breathing room. All the deck really needed was time, and that Sweeper has really given it the time that it needed. So I think that just that one card has improved this deck 2 or 3-fold, honestly, but it got some other new toys to deal with and a format that's a little less hostile to its plans. So I think Temur Reclamation, again, definitely deserves to be an A tier, and hopefully one day it'll move to S tier, but one way or the other, I think that Temur Reclamation will move either up or down a tier, one way or the other. But here we are in the S tier, the absolute best decks in Standard. There are 3 decks in this tier right now, but I'm not going to tell you what they all are at the same time. I'm just going to start with Ramp. Be it Simic or Sultai or Bant, we've seen different Ramp decks produce a lot of results so far in this environment. 3rd and 4th place at SCG Richmond for Simic Ramp, plus many different League 5-0s for different Bant and Sultai ramp decks in this league, in this format so far. So Ramp appears to be a very stable deck, no matter how you build it, but mostly it's the Nissa Hydroid Krasis plan in the late game that makes this deck special, as it always has. Nissa has been called by a lot of people the best card in Standard right now, and I'm not sure how much I agree with that, but I definitely think it's in the top 3 cards in Standard, all things considered. Nissa is just an unstoppable force, especially when you're able to untap with a Nissa on the battlefield and a Krasis in hand. Again, you just feel unstoppable in a lot of those games, and right now, Ramp has the tools it needs to make it to that point in the game, not to mention a bunch of other really neat, new stuff that it got out of this format, out of this last set, but it didn't necessarily need those new things. A lot of Simic Ramp decks that we've seen are literally 0 new cards, but some have new cards. That said, we've seen a Sultai Ramp list that played 0 new cards. We've seen a Bant list that played 0 new cards. So I'm not saying this deck has innovated too much, but until Nissa and Hydroid Krasis rotate, I think they're definitely going to just form the basis of one of the best decks in Standard, almost no matter what else is going on, because that's such a difficult thing to beat. So Ramp definitely belongs in the S tier, but I don't think that it's anywhere near as S tier as our next 2 decks. I know that's an odd statement because there shouldn't be too much separation between the decks in S tier, but I wasn't quite ready to put Ramp in A tier. I think it's better than Reclamation. I think it's better than Rakdos Sack, but I also think it's a little bit worse than Mono Red Aggro and our number 1 deck. Now, Mono Red Aggro could be the best deck in the format right now. It actually has more top 16 finishes than any other deck in the entire format when you compile all the results of Richmond and the Challenge and the Premier. It is placed in the top 16 more than any other deck. That is definitely an important metric, but it also got 2nd at SCG Richmond. And that is a finish that you can't deny. It actually has 2 top 8 finishes at SCG Richmond in that same top 8. So Mono Red is here to stay, mostly because of the addition of Anax. That card does so much for the Mono Red deck. It's actually one of the cards that's putting down some of these other decks, like decks that play Lovestruck Beast aren't nowhere near as good against Mono Red anymore because they have a card like Anax that can attack through it. Same thing with Phoenix of Ash. Also picked up a couple of copies of Phoenix of Ash in a lot of these decks, and that can just fly over all kinds of board states, sink all your mana into it in the late game and hit for 6 or something. It's just a pretty nutty card. And both of these cards, Annex and the Phoenix, have really pushed mono red aggro into the forefront of the standard meta in the early days. But that's relatively typical. In the first couple of weeks of any given season, the fastest deck will often win, and mono red aggro is definitely the fastest deck. The deck is blazingly fast. It will sometimes put you at 10 life before you have your third land out. So it's just blindingly fast on occasion, and it's really difficult to stop those starts, especially with cards like Torbrand and Embercleave that can just really take you through the mid and late game. And they're just incredible top decks. So, the mono red aggro decks don't usually get access to pieces like that, but now they do, and even better top decks. Now they have things like Annex that allow them to fight through sweepers and bigger creatures, and the Phoenix that lets them fly over, which they usually couldn't do, or they'd have to play a bad piece like Chandra's Spitfire. It was kind of bad, especially compared to Phoenix of Ash. So this deck just got only a couple of pinpoint new tools that it needed, but they really were exactly the pieces it needed to rise again in prominence. This deck was already a very popular deck on the arena ladder, especially in best of one. But nowadays, it has, again, the tools it needs to survive against even the best decks in the format, and there is a only slight degree of separation between it and the #1 deck in the format right now, to my mind at least, and that is blue-white control. Now, obviously, the idea is that mono red aggro actually preys on blue-white control decks, but I guess you can smash that, because first at SCG Richmond was blue-white control. Of course, second was mono red aggro. That means that blue-white beat it in the finals. So, just put it that way. But blue-white control has produced a lot more results than that. Not only was it first at SCG Richmond, it was also first in the Standard Challenge, and it got 3 out of the top 8s in the Standard Premier on MTGO as well. So just lots and lots of really high-level results for this deck so far, even more so than mono red. Even though it hasn't put quite as many lists in top 16s, it has gotten by and large better results in the data so far. So I think blue-white control also deserves the nod over mono red aggro, because again, with mono red aggro, fastest deck often wins in the early days or the couple of weeks that a format begins. Blue-white control, the same cannot be said about. Usually blue-white, or any control deck for that matter, takes a little bit longer to put together, get all the slots right for, play things in the correct numbers, know exactly what the format looks like so that you know what you're gaming against in the first place and how to, best prioritize your slots. But all that got thrown out of the window in this format. We didn't have to wait for blue-white control to be a deck whatsoever. Even though I will say that formats are solved a little bit faster, and I know that's kind of a controversial statement, but I think that with all the data that we have these days, and with Arena being what it is, I think that formats are solved a little bit quicker, so maybe that's why blue-white control is such a good deck right now. But at the same time, blue-white control is almost never an amazing deck in the first week or two of a format, and this is definitely an exception to me that proves a rule, because usually, again, these decks would not know exactly what they're game planning against and how to use their slots correctly. But blue-white control doesn't necessarily have to worry about that. I think the blue-white control is more of a no-brainer build than it's been in a really, really long time, and there's actually not that much flexibility in its slots, and maybe that's the secret to why blue-white control is so good right now. But it definitely is, again, like I've said a couple of times in this video, results don't lie, and of all the decks in the format, this has easily, to my mind, the best results. And maybe that's because it got Dream Trawler as just an amazing finisher for the deck, but it also got Shatter the Sky. It needed another 4-mana sweeper. Just in terms of blue-white, it needed a good 4-mana sweeper to begin with. So the deck got a lot of really important tools, not to mention things like Omen of the Sea, Birth of Melodus. I mean, there's a lot of new cards in the blue-white control deck. You could actually make the argument that blue-white control is not only the best deck in the format, it also plays the most new cards of any of the better decks in the format. So maybe that says a lot for how good Theros is, or how at least how good Theros was to this deck. But I know a lot of people hate blue-white. I know a lot of people hate mono-red, but we've got a pretty decent paper rock scissors sort of dichotomy or trichotomy in the S tier, where mono red aggro will often beat blue white control. Ramp will often beat mono red aggro. Blue white control will beat ramp. So the classic paper rock scissors dichotomy. But you also got Temur Reclamation shaking it up. It's kind of another ramp combo deck. Rakdos Sack is a sort of a mid-range combo deck. But you've also got things like mono black devotion, Fires mono white, Rakdos Knights. All of these decks presenting different kinds of threats and different archetypes as well. So I actually, despite what I said on Twitter the other day, I responded to Jeff Hoogland and said I was a little bit worried that we would be in a 3-deck format with 3 other decks sort of on the B tier, on the lower tiers. And someone responded to me and said, like, I don't know what you want if you don't want 6 decks. It sounds like a healthy standard. And honestly, they're right. I'll be the first to say that is 100% correct. And it looks like we actually have more than 6 decks. Even if you're just looking at the first 3 tiers here, I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 decks. So, I mean, again, maybe I spoke too hastily on Twitter. 9 decks is an awful lot. Plus, 4 more decks in this tier, 2 more in this one that could do a thing, but I highly doubt it. I don't know that these decks move up that much in the D tier, but in any case, I do think that the format looks relatively healthy, at least in the early days, but I still have a small amount of reservation, not to be a doomer or anything, but I have some reservations. The format will kind of consolidate into just blue-white control, mono-red, and ramp, and although that's a somewhat healthy format, paper, rock, scissors, and all that, I still think that it's kind of a boring format that we've seen a million times before. I mean, blue-white control, mono-red, and ramp is that's a very basic 3 set of decks for a format to revolve around. And right now, it looks like we might be heading towards that, and we have a couple of other choices to play, sure, but again, I'm not trying to say the sky is falling, but I worry that a 3-deck format, especially with these particular 3 decks, actually won't be that fun, but at the same time, I will say that we're in the kind of format where anything is possible at this point. I really have the idea that blue-white control will be able to use the next couple of weeks to really hammer out its slots correctly. It's going to be a very formidable deck, but I don't think that mono-red, I don't think it'll get to the point that mono-red has no game against it. I just don't think that'll happen. So, again, I worry about a trichotomy here, and really a dichotomy would be even much, much worse. Just between blue-white and mono-red aggro, that's a boring, infuriating format to have to play in. But at the same time, these are very good and somewhat fun decks to play too. And I shouldn't just spread, despair or anything, because there are a lot of decks on this list and all of them can produce results for you in this current format, and who knows, there's probably a deck or 2 out there that none of us have thought of yet that's just a dark horse that's going to come in and spike everybody. Who knows, but here's hoping for it. But that is the standard tier list for now, at least. I know these are often very divisive. It's probably going to get a million dislikes, all that, but do give me your thoughts down there in the comments section. Let me know how you feel about the placement of these decks on the tier list, how you'd shift things around. Decks that I didn't even put on the list. I'm sure I'll get a few of you who are like, hey, you forgot about this mono blue or something. Mono blue probably doesn't go on here. I guess the Thassa deck that plays Cavalier of Dawn and Agent of Treachery. There's a Tempo deck that's mono blue right now that's mostly flash. There's another mono blue deck that's like, the Lotus combo. So none of those I don't think are good enough, but just, let me know anything that I missed for the list here, and just your basic thoughts. Going into the early days of the format before any huge tournaments have hit. I want to know how you feel about it and what decks you like and what decks you don't. But aside from that, just another quick call to action. Make sure you like, subscribe, hit the bell for the noties and all that stuff. Deck techs and more content coming out very soon, plus gameplay, blah, blah, blah. You can also hit up the Patreon and hit up the TCG player link in the description. Pick up any cards from Theros Beyond Death that you haven't yet, especially if you're looking at any of these decks in particular. Right? You might need a piece or 2 for them, so check the links in the description for a wealth of knowledge as usual. And yeah, I'm pretty sure that is it for this one. So I will catch you cats later. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.